Have you ever walked into a room and saw an absolute disaster and asked, what in the world happened? How did this mess get made? Well, when we look at the challenges and the messes in our culture today, it's easy to ask, how did we get here? How in the world did we make this mess? Well, we're going to try to answer how the mess was made this week on the Weekly Disruption. Hey everyone, welcome to the Weekly Disruption Podcast, a weekly dose of biblical truth to cut through the cultural noise. I'm your host, Chris Hemmelman, pastor of First City Church. Now, in one sense, we just have to be honest that since the fall, we have been making a mess. Our sin has been making a mess throughout history. So for thousands and thousands of years, we've been making a mess. So there's nothing unique or new about the fact that our culture has its messes, our culture has its challenges. But in some ways, the mess and the challenge of this particular time in our culture is unique. There's some particular shapes that the sin and the mess takes in our society, and I think it's important for us to understand how and why we got here. So I'm going to attempt to try to answer that question as simply as I can, and that can be difficult in many ways when you're trying to cover hundreds and hundreds of years of history, when you're trying to trace the shape and the ebb and flow of a particular society. There's ways in which you have to be very simplistic in trying to reduce it down to some essential ideas. And so there's going to be ways in which the explanation here is a tad oversimplistic, but I think it will give you an idea of the particular ideas and influences that have shaped our society today to help you understand what we're facing. And in particular, what we need to recognize is that the sort of shape that the sin the sin that shapes and the kind of maybe the false idolatrous ideas that shape our society today are really honed in on this idea of an extreme sort of individualism, that I am the one who decides my identity, decides my future, decides right and wrong, that I live my truth, like all of these ideas and the posture that people have in our society and the way it's affected family and relationships and institution and government and politics and entertainment media, all kind of, if you're going to boil it down, if you're going to sort of reduce it down to a central problem, it's that we have radically sort of set self on the throne. We've individualized ourselves so much that we become king in all things, that we get to define all of life, all of reality, all of truth ourselves. And so how did we get to this place where the self became so radicalized, so centralized, so much so that it was placed on the throne above everything else? Well, that's what we're going to try to answer here on this episode. So the first idea that is influential here is that of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment takes us back to the late 1600s into the 1700s. And the essential idea behind the Enlightenment is that reason and rationality enlighten the individual such that they throw off the darkness of things like superstition and religion. So the idea is that if we were going to understand our world, we're going to understand what is true, understand what is good and evil, then we need to use our reason and our intellect. That we observe the world, we look at the world, we think through things, and we come to conclusions using our own rationality. So the important thing with the Enlightenment is that it sought to sort of push off and overthrow this idea that truth and morality come from an outside source, maybe a supernatural source. They come from divine origin. So rather than understanding things from the place of divine origin, trying to understand meaning and purpose, what is right and wrong from divine revelation, no, we reason, human beings reason. And what's important for us if we're going to progress as a society is we have to throw off things like religion and superstition, because those have no basis in reason. Those have no basis in things like science and scientific discovery. All those things exist outside the natural world, and so therefore cannot have influence because they go against reason. They go against rationality, or so the argument is made. And so the Enlightenment, the influence of reason, rationality, and setting those things up as the ultimate sort of deciders of what is true, what is good and evil, places the individual at the center of making those decisions. Now, at the time of the Enlightenment, you still had a strong influence of the church. You still had the strong influence of society on individuals. So it wasn't as if the Enlightenment just sort of created this sort of radical sense of the self and that the self determines all things. But the groundwork was being laid. the groundwork of human reason, human rationality, centering self, centering the human in our understanding of ourselves and our world was beginning to take root. And then the other idea that kind of went along with this, in many ways was a reaction against it, but was the other side of the same coin, was that of Romanticism. So if Enlightenment rationalism emphasized sort of reason, Romanticism emphasized emotion. So according to the Romantics, reason and rationality, or overdependence on reason and rationality, created sort of a soulless existence. That it was kind of this cold, calculating efficiency and rationality. You think of in like cities that you have to have these, you have to have plan and you have systems, you have structures, and it just creates this kind of cold society, detached from human emotion and from the soul and from things like love and relationship. And you can see how this, giving over to reason and rationality can create some kind of dark things. And you think of how human beings and relationships and care and love and sympathy can be sacrificed for efficiency and accomplishing goals and building systems and structures and the whole idea of progress. And so Romanticism in many ways was rebelling against some of the effects of emphasizing reason and rationality and re-emphasizing emotion. And so for the Romantics, it was get out of sort of the civilization, get out of the structures and the systems, go out into nature, get in tune with your emotion, get in tune with kind of more that naturalistic instinct, intuition, that was kind of threw off reason and rationality. And so the idea was that was more genuinely human. That was more genuinely what it meant to live life to the fullest. And so as you can imagine, that had its own sort of understanding of who we are as people, its own understanding of ethics and even emotion and the role that emotion played. So in many ways, Romanticism was rebelling against Enlightenment rationalism, but it also centered self. So my internal world, my intuition, my emotions, my sense of soul, my sense of awe and wonder, all of that was what was centered, and that became the arbiter, that became the determining factor of how I understood myself, how I understood society, how I understood good and evil. So both Enlightenment and Romanticism, while they were different in many ways, centered the self, centered the individual. And so again, you see the roots of this radical, self-centered, individualistic shaping of the world, shaping of meaning and purpose, starting to take root even several hundred years ago. Moving past the Enlightenment and Romanticism, the next influential idea that we're going to briefly talk about is that of Darwinian evolution. Now, we recognize the concept of evolution. It is sort of the baseline, the default understanding of how we got here. So why is there an Earth? Why is there a solar system? Why are there human beings and animals and plants? Well, the answer you're going to hear in most institutions, most schools, you're going to hear throughout the media is the process of evolution. And so Darwin was the first to sort of put forth this idea that all that exists the way they do now because of this process of evolution and development over millions and millions of years. And so at one time where we had sort of the building blocks of life and we had molecules and they weren't organized in sort of a coherent manner, but over time they begin to organize and begin to develop. And through those millions of years, we get the stars, we get solar systems, we get planets. And so we get plants and animals and human beings. And all of that, the point of all of that is to bring a naturalistic explanation to life. Why is there life? Why are there human beings and planets and plants and animals? Because of naturalistic processes, not because that there is a God who created all things. And so the underneath Darwinian evolution is a naturalistic understanding of the world rather than a supernatural understanding of the world. And you can see the effects that this can have. Once again, if we remove the supernatural, if we remove the idea that God created and God ordered and God gave meaning and purpose, then where do we find meaning and purpose? Well, we find it in the natural order. We find it naturalistically. And so what we determine as good and evil, what we determine as meaning and purpose is tied into sort of the evolutionary goal of anything, which is the perpetuation of the species. What is behind the evolutionary process is what allows something to continue to exist and to grow and to evolve over time. Well, we have to perpetuate our species. We have to keep surviving. And so under evolutionary understanding of the world, human beings have sort of deduced using our reason and rationality and experience that looking at, hey, what has helped us perpetuate our species better? Well, what has allowed for a continued growth as a society rather than dying out as a species. And whatever has helped us grow has been deemed, hey, that's good, that's moral. And whatever has been sort of self-defeating, then that is considered wrong. So if you think of just the concept of murder, why is murder wrong? Well, according to evolutionary biology or the theory of evolution, it's not because we're made in the image of God and we have inherent self-worth because of we are those who are bear God's image. No, murder is wrong because if we kill each other, we're going to wipe out the species. And so for us to outlaw murder is a wise move, is a good move, because it will help us grow and develop as a species. We won't kill ourselves off and cease to exist. Now, there's anybody who kind of holds to evolutionary theory will add other components to that, to be fair, but at its root, it sort of gets reduced down to that why we decided things like murder or things like theft or whatever sort of moral boundary that we've decided, that it was at some point we decided, hey, it's good to set these boundaries because when we do that, we will help to perpetuate the species. So once again, you have a system, you have a theory that puts forward and sort of grounds as the center humanity and our own decision-making and our own setting of what is true and what is good and what is right and wrong and where meaning and purpose come from. So as you can see, each one of these ideas so far moves away from sort of submitting to God and His Word, sort of submitting to a received understanding of who we are, our identity, a received understanding of what is good and what is true, and substituting that for us creating these things ourselves and centering these things ourselves. And so each of these ideas is laying a groundwork, is kind of setting up roots within our society, influencing us as people more and more and more towards kind of a radical, individualized understanding of the world. Yet another idea that has had profound impact on our society is that of existentialism. Now, it's kind of a fancy term, but the concept is actually pretty easy to understand. Within the idea of existentialism is that life has no inherent meaning or purpose. So again, there is no God who is giving meaning and purpose to existence, giving meaning and purpose to human beings. Rather, because there's no existence, we have two choices. One, we can sort of acknowledge it and sort of fall into this self-destructive despair, or we can say, you know what? There might not be any meaning and purpose inherently given to us, but we can create it on our own. We can make our own meaning and purpose, and then we can live for that meaning and purpose to have productive lives. And so existentialism is this massive sort of philosophical cognitive dissonance, meaning we sort of acknowledge that there is no meaning, but even though we acknowledge that, we're going to pretend like there is, and we're going to live our life as if there is meaning. Now, again, it kind of seems contradictory, but this was a very popular philosophy, especially in the early 1900s. And in many ways, even though we may not understand it exactly this way, we can see the influence of existentialism in our society today. Because if there's this sense where I have to create meaning and purpose, that there's no given meaning and purpose to me, I create it. You see how that has trickled down into our current society where now I am the one who defines my identity. I am the one who defines my life. I live my truth. All of that are forms of existentialism. Now, people who talk like that aren't going to say, I'm an existentialist, but they are adopting this sort of philosophical framework and philosophical foundation of existentialism, where there's not a given meaning that we then either have to discover or we submit to. No, we create meaning on our own. Turning to more recent ideas, perhaps the most influential kind of philosophical idea today is that of postmodernism. Now, the essential idea of postmodernism is this, that there are no transcendent truths. There are no what postmodernism calls meta-narratives. And the idea here is that there are no truths that are true for everyone at every place and every time. That there's this overarching, what they would call a meta-narrative, this overarching story that gives meaning and purpose, that reveals truth to every single person who has ever lived and currently lives. So if you think of like Christianity, within Christianity, we have this belief that God is the one true God, and that the truths revealed in the Bible are true for no matter who you are, where you are, when you live, that all are called to submit to the truth of God's word, that God has established reality. He has established what is good and evil, and this affects everyone. It applies to every single person. Well, postmodernism rejects ideas like that and says rather than having an overarching transcendent truth, that there are more localized truths. So localized communities will establish what is true for them, and then they will have to live by that truth that they established. So if you think of being in the United States as a country, we have our particular truths. We have our particular laws, our particular understanding of who we are and what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. And then a country like France is going to have their truth. A country like Germany or China or Russia or Egypt, Africa, places in Africa, wherever you are, there are localized truths that those communities have established. And what postmodernism would say is that if one community, let's say the United States, decides that they're going to try to impose their truth on another country or the rest of the world, that would be wrong. And just like it would be wrong for a particular community to do that, it would be wrong for an individual to do that. So if I, as a Christian, say, hey, everyone should follow Jesus, Jesus is King, Jesus is Lord, and that is true for everyone, no matter where you live and when you lived, that a postmodernist would say that's wrong, because that is true for you, but you cannot impose your truth on other communities and other people. If to do that is as an act of power, as a show of force. So what postmodernism wants to sort of put forward is that any truth claim is not sort of inherently true. Rather, it's true for that community because of those that were in power, that had the levers of power, were able to establish it as so. So truth claims are equal to power. So if I am trying to convince you of my truth, or if I'm getting you to submit to a truth, what I am doing is I am exercising power over you. Another aspect of postmodernism is that truth claims are created through language. So again, there's no inherent truth. Good and evil are not these ideas that sort of exist outside of us. No, rather we create these things through our language. We create identity. We create understandings of good and evil. Understandings of meaning and purpose. Whatever the idea is, whatever the truth claim is, language creates those things. So once again, you see the influence on our society. One, I cannot impose a truth on someone else, according to postmodernism. What's true for me is true for me. What's true for you is true for you. And if either of us tries to get the other to submit or believe the other person's truth claim, well, that is me trying to enforce through power and control on you. The other piece is the language, that we can construct reality with our language. And do we not see this today? When you see people who uphold maybe trans ideology are saying, a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man, just simply through language, simply by stating it is so. And there are other ways that we see this play out, where if I can just create the words for it, if I can sort of speak the idea, then I can claim that it is true, whether it is connected to actual reality or actual truth or not, just by the act of language. I am creating my own truth myself. So postmodernism is a highly influential philosophical influence in our society today. The groundwork of so much of the challenges that we have seen and the challenges we face as Christians today. But understand that the foundation for postmodernism, sort of the roots of postmodernism, were laid all the way back in the Enlightenment, all the way back in the Romantic time period. Darwinian evolution even had influences on what we know as postmodernism. And what's interesting is, like with Enlightenment and Romanticism, those two were reacting against each other, but ultimately were the same, two sides of the same coin. Postmodernism is the same side of the coin of modernism, even though in many ways they're reacting against each other. They're the two sides of the same coin. And what that coin is, again, is centering humanity, centering self, centering the individual as the ultimate decider of meaning and purpose, good and evil, what is true. Postmodernism just happens to be maybe a little bit more honest in some ways, and showing that, hey, if there are no absolute truth claims, then everyone should have their own. Everyone should be able to create their own. And so postmodernism in many ways is the logical end of a lot of this radically centering the individual as the one who decides what is true and what is good and evil. Now, closely connected to postmodernism is this thing called intersectionality. And again, you've probably heard this term, fairly common term. And the idea of intersectionality is that every single one of us carries multiple identities. So me as Chris Hemmelman, I am a white, married, heterosexual male. So those are particular identities that I have as me. And other people may carry, whether it be their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, maybe their social class, but we all kind of carry these multiple identities within our one overarching identity. And what intersectionality wants to do in many ways is sort of parse out those identities to see which of those identities has more privileged status and which of those is more oppressed in society. So me, as a white, middle-class male, those three identities, heterosexual male, those identities all sort of put me in a very privileged class according to those particular people in society. That's a very privileged, that because I am those things, I have been given certain powers and privileges in society. But if you are a black, female, lesbian from maybe a poor class, then those are all identities that are more oppressed. All of those identities have a history of being oppressed by those in power. And so what intersectionality seeks to do is to look at individuals and sort of see where they sort of fall on the spectrum of oppressed or privileged. And what intersectionality wants to do is then take those who have been oppressed and those classes and those identities that have been oppressed and try to reestablish and give them more privilege in society. And how this happens is by creating this sort of strange moral reversal. That if I am, the more oppressed that I am, the more moral I am. The more oppressed identities that I can sort of construct within my overall identity, the more that I can sort of gain ground and kind of get the moral high ground over those who may try to oppress me. So again, talking about a white, heterosexual, middle-class male versus maybe a black, female, lesbian from a poor class, because this individual has more sort of oppressed identities, they would, according to intersectionality, the idea would be to kind of give them the moral high ground over someone like me, or someone with even more privileged status than me, as a way to sort of reestablish sort of a voice in society. Try to give these what would have been seen as oppressed classes a way to gain respectability, a way to gain power, a way to sort of help pull the levers of society. And essentially what this has created is this sort of moral high ground by victimhood. So the more that I'm oppressed, the more that I can establish that I am a victim, the more that I sort of have moral authority, that I am seen as a moral authority over people, the more that I have a right to criticize and to confront power. But if I'm in the more privileged class, then I need to keep my mouth shut. But again, what you see, there's a lot of problems with that idea. There's a lot of challenges with the problems that intersectionality creates. But again, what you have here, if we're kind of looking at the main theme of how these things connect, is, again, you have self-made identity, looking at here ways in which that we've experienced maybe oppression, pain. Some of those things are legitimate, not to say that there aren't ways in which some of those classes have been legitimately oppressed, but by finding identity in those things, I am constructing an identity based on particular facts about me, rather than finding an identity in something that has been given to me, rather than finding a transcendent identity given to me by God, that then I live from that identity. And so, as you can imagine, intersectionality has created a lot of challenges in our culture, a lot of problems, a lot of fighting, because within this idea, You essentially have those that cannot be criticized. Like if I fall into the oppressed class, if I sort of have the moral high ground, then anyone who is less oppressed than me, has more privilege than me, cannot criticize me. Because if you criticize me, then that is just you exercising your power over me. And so again, we can see the problems this creates in our society, and in many ways explains a lot of the infighting and sort of the appeal to victimhood that we see running rampant in our society. Two other important ideas that we need to mention as far as influences in our society are, one, the sexual revolution, and the other is the industrial and technological revolution as well. So the sexual revolution essentially sought to separate sex from procreation. So rather than seeing sex as something that is done between a committed man and woman in marriage for the purpose of, yes, intimacy, personal intimacy, but also for the purpose of procreation, sex is now divorced and separated from a committed marriage relationship, and now is something that is seen as something we pursue for pleasure. And divorcing it from procreation, now sex no longer needs to be something that is just done in a committed marriage, but rather I can do it with those that I'm not committed to, someone that I'm just wanting to enjoy a good time with. And then what also the sexual revolution ended up doing is it started to center pleasure as sort of the ultimate good. If sex is something that I can do freely, and if I'm trying to pursue pleasure, then sex becomes very central to identity, central to my means of happiness, and central to, or if there's any sort of restriction on it, you are restricting my happiness. And so it becomes central to sort of politics and political rights. And so what we've seen is moving from the way the sexual revolution affected families and marriages, and then as more and more sex became, and politics kind of became revolving around sexual freedom and not withholding pleasure and withholding freedom from people, it opened the door to things like legalizing same-sex marriage, and then even sort of the transgender challenges that we're facing, and sort of the ways that has really started to take off. We can trace a lot of that back to the sexual revolution and the ways that our attitudes and our approach to sex was changed, and how that attitude began to affect politics, begin to affect laws, begin to affect even just the ways that we see what it looks like to pursue the good life. So the sexual revolution, hugely influential part of why we are in the mess that we are today. Now, the Industrial Revolution and Technological Revolution, that might seem kind of an odd thing. What is technology? What is the advent of new machines or new computers, or just those kinds of created products? Like, how does that affect us today? Well, a lot of different ways, but let me try to just give one simple way. Both the Industrial Revolution and the Technological Revolution created new possibilities for us, created new understandings of how we can control our world. And so if you think about how technology in many ways helps us transcend our limits, and the more that we can transcend our limits, the more we believe that we can control all things, that we can control this world, we can control things like sickness and disease and death, we can control pleasure and pain, we can construct a perfect society using technology. So what ends up happening through the advance of things like science and technology is that we begin to believe more and more that we really are the center of all things, that we can control, we can determine, we can decide on our own. We don't need God, we don't need divine revelation, we don't need moral limits. We rather than sort of thinking through, hey, what is good, what is true, and how we use technology becomes more, well, hey, we can do this thing, so we should be able to. So there's a lot of ways in which technology has complicated the problems. It has given us whole new sort of horizons to consider our identity. For example, take the whole transgender craze. If it were not possible medically to do surgical procedures on our bodies in order to create the illusion of changing our sex, the technology had not allowed us to kind of make these advances to whatever degree they were, you better believe that it would change our whole conception of male being able to change to female and female changing to male. If all this was hypothetical sort of philosophical ideas, that had died out pretty quickly. But because of technological advances and the ability to actually change our bodies to a degree, we've now opened up greater possibilities, greater understandings of how we can see ourselves. And that has, in many ways, added fuel to the fire of these man-centered sort of philosophies. So technology doesn't necessarily create the philosophy, but it does pour fuel on the fire. It gives us sort of a new way to imagine things and new possibilities, and lets us believe that we have more control than we actually do. So as much as technology is a good thing, and we should seek advancement, and much as it has brought good for us, and we've been able to control our world in some ways that have allowed us to thrive and flourish, it has also created in us this almost godlike belief that we can control the world and we can control our own identities in ways that we were never intended to. And that brings me to the sort of the final point. We're going to close out this podcast. Is part of the reason we are in the mess we're in is not just because of ideas. Listen, ideas don't just sort of fall from the sky. They don't just sort of download into our brains like you would download a program into a computer. No, ideas take time to shape and influence us. They take hundreds and hundreds of years often, and they morph and they change and they produce in us unexpected outcomes. Like when back in the 1600s, 1700s, when the Enlightenment began, no one in the Enlightenment was thinking, "Hey, you know what? 300 years from now, men are going to think they can be women, and women are going to think they can be men. That's going to be the fruit of the Enlightenment." No one thought that. No, they didn't have a concept for that at all. But yet, here we are. And so there are ways in which ideas shape us and form us in unexpected ways over the centuries. But we also have to recognize that the way ideas shape and form us, the way that they influence us, is not just sort of through direct teaching and sort of, again, like the kind of a direct download, but through this process of sort of shaping the way that we understand who we are, and shaping our understanding of what is true and what is good, what is beautiful, shaping our understanding of what is the good life. So there is a philosopher named Charles Taylor who had this great term that he said that the social imaginary. And what he meant by that is that any society kind of has this idea of what is the good life. And it's like we imagine it. So if you were to stop and think, hey, what constitutes a good life? And when a good, like successful, yes, but also living by a set of particular morals. So like I'm a good person, as well as a successful person. We have images, we have ideas of what that is. And what's interesting is those ideas didn't just pop into your brain out of nowhere. Those ideas were given to you, whether it be by your family and your upbringing, whether it be through movies and music and media, whether it just be through the society that you're around, as you've seen people live their lives and you've seen what people have considered success and good people. Like your imagination of what is good in the good life has been shaped by something. And then that shape affects society. And so we call it the social imaginary because it's something that exists within a particular society. And so you have society influencing what is the good and then shaping people. And then those people go and they enter into society in many ways reinforce that by living out sort of those ideals. So the social imaginary is how we are formed to understand ourselves, understand what is true and what is good and what is beautiful, understanding our sense of purpose and identity. And those factors, those things that have shaped us, if we're going to change society, if you're going to shape and change a person's social imaginary, as that has happened over the past 300 some years, then you're going to have to change the things that actually shape a person's imagination. So you're going to have to change things like education. You're going to have to change things like the family and politics. And you're going to have to change things like art and music and media. The things that have influence on how we view the world, the things that shape our minds and our hearts. Those institutions, those things that play a role in society, if you're going to really change a person, you've got to change those. And so these influences of enlightenment, of romanticism, of existentialism, of Darwinian evolution, of sexual revolution, intersectionality, all of those ideas in order for them to shape us, have had to take root in important formative institutions. And that is what we have seen. That is what we've seen happen. We've seen it take place in education. We've seen it take place in the way we understand our families, the way that we do media and music and TV. The important formative institutions in our society have all been influenced by these ideas and therefore have shifted our social imagination. And our society has a very different conception of what it means to live a good life than even 80 years ago. So when we think about the formative impact that certain institutions have on our lives, and we think about the ways in which we are being formed as Christians, we have to be mindful of things like media, things like the stories that we tell and the stories that we listen to. We have to think of things like, hey, what is our family? How is our family shaping us? Or those of us who have families, how are we shaping our kids? How are we shaping our marriages? The things that most impact us intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, those are the things that are going to shape how we understand what the good life is, how we understand what it means to live as a Christian, and what is our meaning and purpose in the world, what is our identity. So we have to be very purposeful in what we allow to shape us, but we also have to recognize if we want to change things, if we want to change society, if we want to even just change our family, just kind of those who are that God has called us to serve and who we are responsible for, then we have to be mindful of the things that shape our social imaginary and shape the social imaginary of those that we live in relationship with. So I want to, as we conclude this podcast, I want to encourage you in a couple things. One, understanding how these different influences have kind of coalesced and created the mess that we're in. Hey, it's good to understand these things. It really is helpful if we kind of see, hey, how did we get to this place? What are sort of the underlying ideas in each one, and maybe how we have been influenced by them? So I'd encourage you to go and study some of these ideas further, to see some of the nuances and the ways that they have shaped society and some of these things have played out. So go study more, learn more, understand better. But it's not just enough to understand these ideas. We really have to take stock in our own hearts of how these things have shaped us. Because no matter who we are, growing up, living in the world that we live in, it is inescapable that there's some ways that these things have shaped our understanding of the world. They've shaped our understanding of what is true and what is good and what is right and what is wrong, our own identity. And there are ways that they have shaped us significantly, and there are subtle ways. So we have to do the hard work of kind of thinking through, hey, how have I been formed in a way that is not biblical? How have I been formed by these ideas rather than God's word and God's truth? And then when we recognize that, we have to do the hard work of reformation, which means repenting of things that are untrue and unbiblical, but it also means changing how we understand the world and changing how we live. So if there are ways in which our social imagination, our understanding of what the good life is, has to change, then we need to do that hard work. We need to start to reform ourselves by the stories that we tell, the truths that we listen to, the things that we give our time and our energy to, the way that we live our lives and our families and our jobs and our church and our society, all the things that are going to shape us and influence and shape other people. We have to get to the hard work of aligning those things with biblical truth rather than these influences in our society that have kind of created the mess that we're in. So, covered a lot of history here, covered a lot of different ideas here. Tried to make it as simple as possible, but in many ways, just scratching the surface. And in many ways, there's much more that could be said. So again, I want to encourage you to understand more, read more, seek to see kind of the mess that we're in and the challenges that we face. Ultimately, though, so that we can be more faithful. We can be more faithful in our service to the Lord and our love of other people, and more faithful in being formed as those who are obedient to Christ, submitting to the Lordship of Christ and worshiping Him, and then going and sharing the gospel, spreading the gospel, seeing that His kingdom would advance for the glory of God and the good of others. So I hope you found this podcast helpful in some ways. Would love to interact with you. If you have questions, comments, feedback, or topic ideas, feel free to shoot us an email at disruption@firstcitybellevue.com. Also, hit that subscribe button or subscribe to our iTunes page or Spotify to support the work we're doing. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time for another episode of the Weekly Disruption.